Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining today's webinar. The Executive Advisory is hosting. My name is Heather MacArthur. If we haven't met before, it's a pleasure to have you as part of this today. Any questions, feel free to put that in the Q&A. I'll be addressing that throughout the session as well as towards the end. But today we're going to talk about building teams to weather the storms of change. And I know all of us are going through probably more change than what we're used to, and it's just continuing to compound. And I'm noticing that area that's experiencing a lot of the stress and the strain are how teams are working together. And some of that's because we're a lot of times very organic about the way that we approach teams. So I'm going to dive in today. What we're going to talk about are you actually building a team? So in some situations, we have these expectations that something's going to operate as a team and what our mind kind of comes up with as a team. I find the biggest difference is that people go like, we're a team, we're nice to each other, we're polite to each other, versus really understanding what the purpose of a team is and how a team's supposed to perform. So we're going to talk about the four different ways I see groups work together. There's probably more versions, but I want to give you those as just reference. We'll talk about what the role of a leader is in this situation, who belongs on the team in terms of capabilities and skills, and then what to look for when it comes to a team working together and how to gauge how should we be partnering with each other, collaborating with each other? When is it right to do solo work versus group work? And then last but not least, how do you navigate changes as a collective team? All right, let's dive in. So, my question is, are you actually building a team? The four ways that I see people come together in the workplace is honestly the first two is where I see the biggest struggle is that they are really operating more as a group than working as a team. That means that they're doing a lot of work independently with individual targets, but there's not necessarily a lot of cohesion or crossover. And what I'm finding more and more is that organizations used to operate with much more of a group approach. Everyone's so busy, they're just doing their own thing, and then you check in every so once in a while. But the team way of working is there's much more interdependence, and a lot of workplaces, that kind of complexity is needed to get the most out of the work that needs to get done. There's a consortium, which is separate entities, maybe one strategic project. In larger organizations, I see this where you've got different functions kind of coming together for a one project moment, and then they go back, but they're run by different leaders. Even if you do sit under the same company, a lot of times it can feel like a consortium because I'm not in control of this other team. There's a lot of cooperation that has to go on. And then the collective, where this is a little bit more of like we get together, we have some shared values, we want to do some things, but there's not really anyone in charge. In terms of what I see as a common one for that, I would probably describe like maybe some employee resource groups that operate a little bit more like a collective. There's usually not, sometimes you'll have an executive sponsor that's running things, but even then they tend to kind of leave it up to the group to govern and figure out how they're going to get the work done and what they're supporting, what they're bringing to the table for the organization. So those are some examples. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. So for the group, if you're looking for, am I working in a group? That's people gathered together who may share a space or general interest, but operate very independently. Their goal is 100% their individual targets, and those individual targets may lead up to the organization, but they kind of produce in separate personal outputs. A lot of you that are labeled as teams within an organization might be operating this way. And when that happens, we tend to throw we're a team mainly because we get together and we update each other. A great example of this is what I would call senior leadership teams. I see this happen all the time. They're like, we're a senior leadership team, but we don't actually make things happen together. We get together once a month, we give each other updates. We might hash out where there's some, friction here and there when our groups kind of, cross paths. But other than that, we're not really co-creating anything, which I personally think is a big mistake for senior leadership teams. It should really function as a team and do key things for the organization. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Accountability is strictly individual, meaning that there's, usually some manager or somebody who's in charge, and they're the ones running the performance, but there's not really this kind of like, how are you showing up with the other team members? And I'm not responsible for how your work shows up. I'm only responsible for mine. And we don't really cross over a whole lot. And it's really that single leader. I think this can work great for certain situations. I'm seeing this work less and less as things get more complex and innovation is such a big competitive advantage for organizations. So I feel like kind of that old, factory working kind of thing where it's a lot easier to get work done because we're not crossing over. So we do it for the simplicity of it, the clarity of it, but not always because it's the most intentional thing to do. I find people that, especially if you've got a manager who's like, I'm laid back, I don't really like to put pressure on people, you'll notice that they tend to have these kind of separate ways of working and they tend to be leading a group because it doesn't really require too much on their part to do the coaching, to do the intentional strategy about what it means to be a team. As a team, now this definition is different. It's a tight-knit unit of people with complementary skills working closely together. The goal is a shared unified outcome or a finish line. Now, that could be a strategy for the team, a year end or even a multi-year goal. It could be, and I'll show you the example in a second, a project team, those types of things. But we are trying to achieve something collectively together, and it requires all of our, input and effort, the different ways that we think, the different ways that we operate. In most organizations, I find there is an expectation that there is a collective happening and that, a lot of times because the head count's just not that high, people have to carry different hats and cross over and get things done together. But then the error is, oh, we're doing this because we're nice people and we're going to play well in the sandbox versus how are we really leveraging each other's different skills to get the most out of the talent that's on the table? That requires intention and strategy, not just an organic, we're going to be nice to each other. The accountability, there's mutual and collective accountability. And the way that this looks, you usually still will have one person who's responsible or oversees performance. But there's a higher kind of, I guess, value put on not just what gets delivered, but how it gets delivered. Performance conversations tend to talk about, okay, you delivered this by the deadline, it hit a certain quality, but also how did you leverage people in the team to make this happen or people outside of the team to make this happen? There's an emphasis on an expectation that it's not cheating or it's not slacking by leveraging other people. It's actually expected because the idea is the work's really not going to hit the level that it needs to if it's not done as a creative collective. It's not done collectively just so everyone feels like they're part of something. There's really a business goal at the end of that to achieve. The accountability is mutually and collective, even though there's probably someone who's in charge of performance. What that means is when performance and accountability is discussed, that other people's experience of you is taken into account. So if I'm your manager and I'm giving you a review, I'm not just giving you a review on how I experience you. I'm also looking at like, well, how does the rest of the team experience you as someone to work with and achieve goals together? There's the complete understanding that let's say we're peers and I'm having an issue with how things are going or you're not meeting a deadline, that yeah, it's my job to talk to you about that. I may not come in as your manager and like if you don't do this X, Y, and Z, but I have a conversation about the impact that you're having. We discuss with each other how we're getting work done. It doesn't all just sit in the manager's box, but the manager doesn't get to abdicate out of it as like, well, that's not for me to get involved. I don't want to. I can't tell you how many times I've coached a manager who's like, oh, I don't want to get involved in all that, human resource stuff. I'm like, no, 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 my friend, that's a people leadership job, and it can't be delegated to others. So if you're running a team, you know that your role is there, but that there is more of a collective, and the structure is highly collaborative with shared responsibilities. If you're trying to drive new strategies, if you're trying to make sure that you're evolving as a team and growing, there's a level that you've got to operate as a team. A group doesn't tend to evolve that way. A group, because they are so siloed in what they're doing. And I'm going to pull this back to that example that I used of the senior leadership team. When the senior leadership team shows up as just a group, what I find when I'm brought in is that the CEO or the board is looking at that and going, they're not really helping our organization strategically. We're having issues with the culture because guess what? A senior leadership team really needs to be intentional about how they're cultivating the culture, setting the norms. They're not, really driving the budget collectively. They sit there and they bicker about who gets what budget and use or lose and that type of thing, but not collectively of based on what the organization is trying to achieve. How do we collectively look at the finances so that we're making, priority decisions from the organization's lens versus just my function lens? Talent. There's so many organizations that there's not really a strong talent strategy because senior leaders aren't getting together to look at the talent as collective. They kind of know their function. Maybe they're planning for their function, but they're not looking at it as an organization. You really start to feel that when employees describe, especially in larger organizations, that they can't transfer their talent and their skills to another part of the organization because, the language doesn't transfer, no one knows about them, there's no real exposure. So it's almost like they've got to leave the company to go get those opportunities versus, you've got these really large global organizations and they're stunted by the talent because they can't transition them across these boundaries. So the talent leaves and they end up having these, costs where instead, if they had a more collective approach, especially at that senior leadership level, there'd be more crossover and you get, more juice for the squeeze basically with your talent and longer tenures, but those tenures wouldn't be stagnant tenures. Okay. A consortium, like I said, this is where it's an association of distinct entities such as corporations, universities, or governments. It can be smaller, like I said, you got a large organization. It could be certain functions that get together where there's not one person who's in charge of things, but they are getting together for a potential project or those types of things where, honestly, like let's say there's a tech overhaul or a whole new, payroll system getting put into a large organization. I tend to, even though they might be called projects, they tend to operate as a little bit more consortiums. They've all got to collectively agree. There's not this one person who's calling the shots. And so it's the agreements, it's the contracts, vendors are involved. That tends to work a little bit more like what an external consortium might run with. And then a collective I mentioned before, that's where, I'm reflecting this to what an internal organization might feel like. And employee resource groups, I often see run as that collective. You've got all these experts coming to the table, but they're there because they really care about the mission of that group. A lot of times the executive sponsor is there to help make sure things are elevated and move forward, but they're not really there to tell the group what to do. And so that's where I see it kind of operate a little bit more. They're really there for the values and how they want to support the organization through that particular priority. Okay. Let's talk about when a group is not a team. Interdependence is missing. People can succeed or fail on their own. Whether anybody else shows up, you're kind of out on your own. Here's where I see that cause a lot of challenges and sometimes turn it into toxicity, is we're treating it, we're calling it a team, but it's really a group. And what happens is when someone is operating and thinking that they're in a team, there's a level of collective accountability, like I talked about before. The way that we're treating each other is a priority of how performance is determined. It's not just did we hit our numbers, did we hit our goals, how are people feeling in the culture. In a group, a lot of times it's like, well, the culture is separateness, so we shouldn't cross over. um, People can be really nice to each other in a group, but they're not, when things are going wrong in your area, it tends to be like, oh yeah, that's not my area. Well, I'm not involved in that, so it's not really my problem. Whereas in a team, it's, hey, if it's affecting one person of the team, it's affecting the collective. Let's talk about how that is because we are doing things so interdependently, because the culture is about how are you showing up in the team culture. So what you have instead is a work group. If people focus only on personal goals, so their unique individual goals, cooperation waits for direct orders. So we're not going to cross over and do anything unless the head honcho says that we need to. And hard conversations get avoided. So that's where I don't want that to mean that there's something wrong with operating as a group. I just think it's very critical that you call that out and not do what I see sometimes people want to label it a team because it feels good to be a team. Like, oh, we're a team. And oh, just like a sports team, that type of thing. But the sports team on the field is collectively achieving something and has to rely on one another. And I'll hear people reference that. But the reality is you're really showing up as a group. So own that it's a group. It sets up what the expectations are in terms of what people have expectations around the backup they're going to have, someone having their back in situations, why and how and when they would surface issues. And that's where I say like hard conversations get avoided because when it gets hard and stuff shows up, I find that people have the groups that are really not operating as a team tend to revert back to the group process, which is, oh, that's not my area. Oh, that's not, well, well, technically we're not really operating that way. So we're going to go back to the group. And so that's usually because they start to move towards more like what a team requires. And so sometimes I see people kind of flirt with that. The good stuff we want to take from the team, the collegiality and the feeling like we're in something together and like, yay, we like each other. But then when it comes to this tough stuff, it's like, no, 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 we're actually a group. Like we don't, that's not what we do. So either is fine as long as it aligns with the work that you're doing. But I'd really be clear about what you're operating as and not confuse the two just because one feels nice to say, but you're not really doing the work and the intention behind it. Sometimes the answer is not a team. So when individual work is best to do, there's simple tasks, routine duties, there's full control, and it requires a deep focus. So if that's the case, then let's not muddy the waters and put all the chefs in the kitchen just because we want to say that we're collaborative. When you need a team, when things are complex, the goals are large, they mean many different skill sets. I'll go back to the senior leadership team. You cannot run an organization as a group. That's what creates siloed working environments. Massive workloads, meaning you don't have enough headcount. And from most of the companies I work with, there's usually not enough headcount. And then creative growth. You want the innovation, you want to keep evolving. That's where I go. I lean towards rarely do I see an organization that can really thrive without a commitment to teamwork. I think there's times where it can be a group and there's sections of work that can be a group. But overall, any organization that's got, that's up to stuff usually has a requirement to operate as a team in some capacity. Groups only outperform solo workers. And when I referencing here, groups and teams only outperform solo workers when the task demands complex problem solving. So once again, if the work that's happening is very easy, very, direct, simple, easy to repeat, then having a team involved tends to actually just muddy the waters and make things slow down. And that's where it's like we don't have to decide everything together. Like someone should just decide what water cooler goes in the break room, that type of thing. It shouldn't be this constant, everything's a democratic process. Okay, so then what does leadership need to do? Leading a group and leading a team is different. So for if you're leading a group, direct control, you're assigning the tasks, you're delegating. I find in modern day organizations, there's a lot of times where you're working with vendors, a lot of vendors, and it tends to be, yes, you're using vendors, but they're not really the team. They're a group. You direct what's happening to these different vendors. You're in charge. You're the one that's signing off the expense reports and whatnot, but you're not really in charge of developing them. And each person's kind of going and doing their own thing, and the work is independent. But it's not necessarily where they cross over. Once again, I have a hard time finding where a group really operates as just a group throughout the year in an employee-based kind of situation. Team, you've got to facilitate and empower. You guide the process. You definitely let members decide how work gets handled. There is this collaboration that happens, but you have the final say. You've got to make the final call. And I find that leaders, we've either got this very extreme of like the micromanagement, I can't let anything go. And that's actually a little bit more like the group on one version of a group. I'm in charge. I say who, when, what, where, and you all just go do my marching orders. But there's another extreme that's actually a little, kind of hiding behind the group title, which is that passive, like, I'm so laid back and I'm not the kind of person that tells people what to do. I'm a nice manager. And what you're really doing is you're creating a lot of confusion because you're not laying down, here's what's expected, here's a decision making, here's where accountability is. And yes, I want to do that in partnership with the team. But at the end of the day, I'm owning and taking responsibility for what my role is because everyone knows that I have it. And maybe some enjoy the fact that they don't have to come to me for sign-offs on things, but they're also the same people who are going to complain that there's not enough structure and there's not enough decision making happening. Shared accountability, success or failure belongs to everyone. Once again, the buck stops with the leader, but everyone feels a sense of accountability for making sure that this gets over the finish line. There's not oh, that's not my job, that's somebody else's. So my head and eyes are just straightforward. Someone else is having a problem, it's not my issue. And interdependence, the leader builds trust and collective problem solving. This is where psychological safety is so critical. You could probably have a group and you may not run into whether or not there's even psychological safety there because people aren't really taking a lot of risks with one another. There's not a lot of crossover. So you'll see people go like, oh, this is such a psychologically safe place. We love working with each other, but you're not really crossing over. And what I find is sometimes things get pushed where the work evolves and all of a sudden now we've got to get stuff done together. And people are shocked that it's gotten, that all of a sudden this person that they loved, and thought was so wonderful that they only saw in update meetings. Now it's like, oh, we've got conflicts because we're trying to co-create. When you're leading a consortium and leading collective, those are very different. It's negotiated authority. There's a governance discipline when it comes to a consortium, protected autonomy. A collective is stewardship over control, consent-based decisions, and then that belonging as a currency. So the employee resource groups is what I talked about. This session doesn't delve deep into that. It's much more of that team group, and I'm honestly focused more on the team piece of it. What is your team actually for? So I've mentioned leadership team. There's usually a function team, meaning you serve a function within the organization, whether it's the IT team, it could be the legal team, it could be the production crew. You're serving a business function for the business. And that could be large scale group of teams, like a department. It could be one team, and it could be, layered down depending on the size of your organization. And then there's a project team. It is for a defined amount of time to accomplish a certain goal, and then you will disperse into whatever else you might do. A lot of us are part of a function team as well as part of different project teams where we cross over with different functions and get work done. If you're working in a large scale organization and if you're leading that organization, you might be in a leadership team, heading up a function, as well as being part of project teams. So that's a lot of hats to wear, but usually as you move up in senior leadership roles, those are the kind of hats you have to wear. So the capabilities of leaders in leading an actual team. I put first and foremost emotional intelligence because psychological safety is such a huge part of teams really operating on a high performance level. Trust is such a huge part of it. So someone's ability to just be self-aware. What am I good at? What am I not good at? What do I need to learn? And a capability, metacognition is the skill of being able to sit and notice your thoughts and think about your thoughts and choose them, as well as being aware and prioritizing, building your awareness around how you impact others. It can't be like, well, I'm fine, so why is there a problem? Like, well, if you're having a problem, it must be you because I'm doing fine. Or even as a leader, it can't be, well, you seem to be the only one with the problem. Everybody else is fine, so we're good. It really is, how do I, create an environment that's safe for people and what the expectations are, what the boundaries are, and what will be tolerated, what won't be tolerated, and what are you going to support, what are you not going to support? Because someone may not fit within the team. What they're looking for may be different than what you're creating as a team. But if you can't even answer what you're trying to create as a team, then you're going to run into a lot of problems. You should have a vision and direction. What is it that you're trying to build? Where are you taking the organization? Ideally, you build that collectively with your team, but you have to be the driving force of it. That is going to be your responsibility. Decision making in ambiguity. When there's a lot of gray area and it's, gosh, this could be anybody's call. No, it's your call. You've got to make the call. You're holding the purse strings, so to speak, whether it's your own business or you're the person who's in charge of the cost center within an organization. Coaching and development. You are tasked the minute you take on the role as a people leader. And I find it interesting that people kind of they want the title or they want the clout, or sometimes they are in this position and it kind of happened organically and they got more resources and grew something, and then they're like, oh, but I'm not in charge of anyone. No, you are, and you're in charge of growing the organization you're in charge of. You're also in charge of growing and developing the people under your watch. Do they have development plans? Have you aligned that with what their career goals are? And unfortunately, a lot of leaders are, gosh, they're hungry for that promotion or that next level, but they're not really understanding that they are actually doing people management as a profession now. The minute you step into that role, it's on top of the function that you're leading. It's on top of the business and subject matter expertise that you have, that you are responsible for the growth and development of the people under your watch. And then creating productive conflict in the organization. We need the conflict. You're not going to get the innovation without it, but without the psychological safety there, people are going to start to opt out. And honestly, that's a smart strategy. When I'm coaching others, if they're in a toxic environment, it is not a smart strategy for them to continue to push and make themselves vulnerable, especially when the power dynamics just are not in their favor. And when you started to hear people go, was it quiet quitting? And there was just this uproar. Like, what do you mean quiet quitting? And that's horrible. I never spoke to somebody who was, quote unquote, quiet quitting, that was doing that because they enjoyed it. It was, or being, like out of just spite. It's because the situation just, wasn't created by the leader to create a really safe environment. And that includes holding someone accountable for their performance and maybe exiting someone because they're not performing up to what the standards are. So when a manager was like, oh, they're all quiet quitting, I'm like, well, where's your performance management? Where's the feedback on what your expectations are? How are they even managing to quiet quit? Why aren't you having career conversations? Now, that doesn't mean it all sits with the leader. The team members have an accountability as well. Our emotional intelligence as team members, how are we reading the room? How are we looking at our impact on others? That we're training and looking to grow and develop in our role. Even if we don't want to move up, how are we going to elevate and modernize? Candid communication, we're also engaging in respectful candor. Adaptability, it's not going to be my way. It's not going to be the way that always was for the last 10 years. Things are going to change. And an ownership mindset. It's not just I'm clocking in and clocking out. I'm owning this, I'm delivering. I tend to look at it from a skill, will, and hill area. What skills do you have? How willing are you? And what are the outside factors that might be getting in the way? The goal is ideally to have high skill, high will, low hill. Um, I'll give you some situations. If you've got no skill but a high will and a small hill, then that's usually coachable, easily coachable situations. You got someone who wants to learn, leverage that. Toxic is low skill, no will, small hill. And that's someone who's just like, I'm not interested. I've got this, but I'm kind of checked out. And in a leader, this is really toxic situation. I mean, it's toxic in any scenario, but leaders in particular. And then at risk, you've got someone who's high skill, high will, but there is a steep hill. That's where you start to get that turnover. Why would I stay? Why not take my talent somewhere else? Where's the commitment? It needs to be a commitment to balance the self and others, my needs, as well as the needs of others. Focus on the role within an organizational mindset, not just what my area is. Speak up bravely when things aren't working. We've got to create an environment for that. Demonstrate empathy, respect, authenticity, and protect that psychological safety for everyone. Now, how do we work together? There's a lot of information on this. I know we're coming up on time. I have a model called the 5 C's. And what you'll see here is competition, cooperation, coordination, collaboration, consolidation. Competition is the toxic stuff. To me, and I'm not talking about friendly competition where we're kind of just having a game about one particular thing. I'm talking about people within the so-called team or even group are competing with one another and basically saying that there should be a winner and there should be a loser. If you've got a loser in your group or a team, something's wrong. Or even a desire to have a loser, something's wrong. The cooperation, coordination, collaboration, consolidation, all really viable ways to get work done as a team. The one that requires the most sophistication and trust as a team is that collaboration piece. So it's not you've got to collaborate all the time. That's not the point. The point is your team set up to be able to collaborate when it is the right thing to do to get the work done? And I find sometimes people kind of err on the side of staying in the cooperation and coordination lane because it just feels better, it seems easier, and it's not as ambiguous. Um, and I'll just throw out here that when it comes to navigating change, that forming, storming, norming, performing kind of Tuckman model that's been around for a long time, it's how are we going to be good in all 4 stages? The mistake is thinking you can bypass the storming. We need to do forming really well. We need to do storming really well. That sets us up for good norming and performing. If not, we end up having that dysfunction norming. We're just really apathetic, burned out. We don't want to work together, but we're tired of fighting. So that forming, storming stage is really important. Here's where we come in to help. We have worked with teams to help with their strategy, their culture design. We do team offsites, skill building workshops for teams to learn how to do these skills, including the leadership. And then we also do team coaching. So if the team is working through some things, we can do some team coaching that involves some one-on-one as well as some collective conversations that we facilitate. So reach out to us, even if it's just you have some thoughts, you have some questions. It's a free consultation. We can talk you through what the best resources. We want to help, even if it's not us that are helping, if it's even just getting you pointed in the right direction, maybe using your internal resources there inside your company. Or maybe you just needed to chat through something and you're good on your own, but we want to be part of your community. Well, I appreciate your time today. I highly recommend you've got the QR code here to sign up for our next webinar, especially if you found these tips helpful. What's coming up next is that shift from individual contributor to manager, which kind of plays on this topic. So I'll leave this up here. Once again, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to hang out for a little bit and see if there are any questions in the Q&A that people may have had. One question came in and just asked, what do you do when your manager is not stepping into that role and taking the leadership part of it is, look, I say, try to have conversations with them. Sometimes the leader just does not, didn't get the training and support from the organization in the first place. And so they're doing the best that they can a lot of times. So have a conversation with them, provide them some feedback, talk about what the experience is, what you're looking for, what can you do to support. I say start with that, and it might take more than one conversation. I think a healthy rule, though, is a little bit of, three strikes and you're out. And is there somebody else that you can talk to if that's not changing? Especially if you've got an organization with, say, or, HR support, or maybe the leader skip level above them. It's not about going over their heads. It is, and I just would be direct with them. I think this is a bigger issue than we're solving in this one-on-one. Can we bring in support and then ideally enlist them into that? I think the hard part is when you're running into somebody without that emotional intelligence and maybe even kind of retaliatory as to the fact that you're bringing them this type of feedback. And that's where I'd say, partner with HR if you can. Hopefully that's not the deep level of toxicity that you're dealing with, that this is really just, human beings trying to figure things out together. Feel free to share this webinar with folks if it helps kind of put some words to the issue at hand, and some language, some common language that you can use to work things out. All right, folks, thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully you got some good nuggets there. If there's anything you want to dive deeper in for, please feel free to reach out to us. Happy to hop on a call and chat things through. Take care of yourselves.